What's up, everyone? I hope all of you guys had a good week 4, and that's actually what I want to talk to you guys about. I'm going to be doing a recap, and it's something I want to start doing on my channel moving forward. Usually at the beginning of my main picks video, I usually talk about, the previous week and whatnot, and I usually take up, 2 or 3 minutes in that video. And instead, I figured I would go ahead and just do a separate video so I can do a little bit more in depth, kind of talk about what I got right, what I got wrong, and how I can learn from that moving forward. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So let's go ahead and take a look back at some of the picks that I gave out last week and how they did. Starting off with the first stack that I gave out, and that was Phillip Rivers and Terrell Williams. Now, Phillip Rivers did not have a bad game by any means. I mean, it was really a Phillip Rivers-esque game. He put up 22.8 points, threw for over 300 passing yards, and 2 passing touchdowns. He did throw a late game interception, which is actually his first interception on the season, but that's when he was trying to charge a late game comeback against the Saints and trying to put his team into field position to kick a game-winning field goal. So, I talked about it in the main video as well. I really didn't know who to stack him with. I said I liked Terrell Williams because I thought he was a good value option. But, I said don't be afraid to stack Phillip Rivers with Melvin Gordon. And, I'm glad I kind of took my own advice there because I did that a little bit. I didn't do that a ton, but if you did that, you would have did pretty well because Melvin Gordon had a pretty good game. So, overall, it wasn't a terrible stack. As far as Terrell Williams goes, we saw a pretty Terrell Williams-like game. I mean, he put up 9 points, which, isn't awful at this price range. At $4,400, if you're getting 9 points out of him, you can't complain, but so much. I mean, obviously I wanted to get more out of him, and he was literally 1 yard short of scoring a touchdown on a little screen. They had like a little screen pass well into the red zone. Everybody thought they were going to run the ball. They were like 2 or 3 yards out, and they ran a little just quick screen to Terrell Williams on the outside, and he ended up a yard short. So he could have got in there, and that definitely would have made a good little statement on his point and stat line, but he had 8 targets, 5 receptions for 40 yards, and 40 yards is actually the shortest or the least amount of yards he has in his career right now in a game. In his first game ever, he had just 2 receptions, but he had 90 yards, and since then he hasn't put up 90 or more yards. So, I still think Terrell Williams is going to be a guy I'm going to target going forward. I think he just has so much big play potential and has so much upside. But right now, he is still kind of a risk, I guess. But, honestly, if you would have went the route of Travis Benjamin, it really wouldn't have made a big difference. He didn't have a killer game either. So, he had pretty much a fumble that cost him the game. He just didn't play that great. And honestly, the guy that ended up blowing up in this game was Dontrell Inman. And I'll be honest, I had some Inman in my GPP lineups last week, but not this week. And, yeah, so if you would have guessed that, Dontrell Inman would have had his best game of his career, this week against the Saints, I guess you could have, made a reasonable argument that, it was possible because going up against that terrible Saints defense. But, and so just kind of disappointing out of Terrell Williams. I thought we were going to see a little bit more out of him, but, he's still going to be a guy I'm going to be looking at going forward, especially if they're going to be playing they're playing the Oakland Raiders this week. So this is obviously a good spot for these two guys moving forward. So you very well could be hearing me talk about them again soon. Okay, so moving on to the next stack, that was Matthew Stafford and Marvin Jones. And this is another huge letdown. I mean, if you would have told me that, Detroit was facing the Chicago Bears, yes, they were on the road, but they were still facing the Chicago Bears. Their defense has been mediocre at best this season. They had injuries in the secondary. And if you would have told me that Golden Tate would have only played 53% of the snaps, I'd have told you that Matthew Stafford and Marvin Jones probably could have put up, their, whatever it was, like 70-point total they had last week. But unfortunately, that did not happen. And, honestly, it was probably one of the worst fantasy games for Matthew Stafford in a really, really long time. In fact, I'm looking here. This is the lowest scoring fantasy game Matthew Stafford has had in the past 16 regular season games. The next closest would be 11, and then after that, the next closest would have been 16 points. So extremely disappointing game out of Matthew Stafford. and Marvin Jones. Now, Marvin Jones salvaged a little bit. At 12.4 points, it is his lowest point total of the season so far. He did have only 12.5 points in week 1. But one thing that's interesting is he had his least amount of targets on the season and his least amount of receptions and the least amount of receiving yards. So by far his worst game of the season. And it was interesting. I'll be honest, I didn't get to see much of this game. But this game did not really unfold anyway like I predicted. I thought that it could be, a little bit higher scoring game. But, this was definitely a stack that I was looking at more in GPP, big tournament style contest anyway. So it wasn't a huge blow to me. Now, Marvin Jones, if he could have put up more points, that would have been great. Honestly, if he could have just gotten to the end zone once or had, maybe a few more catches and maybe just got to that 100-yard receiving mark, we would have been okay. And, he could have salvaged, for at least like a 20-point day or so. But, he didn't do that, obviously, and it hurt me in my cash game, in my cash game lineups. But honestly, he wasn't the main guy I was kind of focusing on in cash games, and I'm going to talk about cash game lineups here in a little while. But this stack was obviously a huge letdown, but I was more disappointed in Marvin Jones than I was Stafford, in my opinion. And Jones is still going to be a guy I'm going to look at going forward, and I still think he has a good matchup. Almost every week these days, because he's getting, Marvin Jones has kind of turned into Detroit's new Megatron. He has Calvin Johnson like numbers ever since he's come to Detroit. So as far as actual production and usage, so I like Marvin Jones going forward, but this just wasn't his week, and it's gonna happen from time to time. So I was off on this stack as well. So the third and final stack that I talked about in last week's video was Cam Newton and Kelvin Benjamin. I also mentioned Greg Olsen later in that video, and I also mentioned him briefly that I was probably going to be playing Cam, Kelvin, and Greg in some lineups. I even mentioned Ted Ginn Jr. And so the whole game, the Panthers just seemed a bit out of sync. They really didn't seem like, they were locked in. They didn't seem like they were prepared well. The coaching, the play calling, everything about the Panthers just looked terrible on both sides of the ball. And we'll see what happens going forward. Now, the crazy thing is, Cam Newton could have salvaged a good fantasy day if he had not gone down with that concussion. When Derek Anderson came in, he threw for like 175 yards, something like that, and threw for a pair of touchdowns. He did have a pair of picks, but so if Cam would have did that, he would have put up about 30 fantasy points or so, and he could have salvaged. He would have had most of those points would have been in garbage time when the Falcons were in prevent defense kind of. They weren't in super prevent defense, and a lot of the good plays that Derek Anderson and the Panthers offense put together were actually pretty legit plays, to be honest, because the Falcons were still bringing pressure and whatnot against Derek Anderson, but obviously they were still playing some loose coverage and whatnot. But the one drive that Cam led before the Falcons or before the Falcons took out Cam on that concussion, he led the drive. He had some good passes. He threw a touchdown pass to Kelvin Benjamin, ran in for a 2-point conversion, and on that 2-point conversion is when he got popped for that concussion because he really wasn't paying attention, and it kind of cost him. He didn't see the guy. If you watch the replay, you can see that he was looking off to the right, and he didn't see the guy to his left to the last second, and he kind of was just bracing for impact at that point. So we'll see what happens going forward if Cam's able to play this coming Monday. Luckily, he does have an extra day to rest. If I was a betting man right now, I would bet that he probably isn't going to play, but I really hope he does play for, selfish reasons, being a Panthers fan. But as a whole, the Panthers just played poorly. But this stack did okay. I mean, Cam, he passed for 165 yards, one pass touchdown, nothing special. 15 points out of someone who's nearly $8,000 in salary is not a good day. Kelvin was able to salvage a little bit as well. And, his targets went up significantly from last week. Only one target last week against the Vikings. Xavier Rhodes has proven to be a legit corner, as we saw him lock down Odell Beckham and company last night on Monday Night Football as well. But 7 targets, 3 receptions. He was able to get into the end zone. Like I mentioned, that one passing touchdown Cam had was to Kelvin. And, it wasn't the best of days for either of these guys, and we're definitely going to see better days out of them moving forward. But like I said, if Cam hadn't gone down, he would have put up a decent fantasy day, believe it or not. Derek Anderson definitely seemed like he preferred to throw to Greg Olsen, so maybe that can be a sneaky GPP play moving forward if Cam's going to miss some significant time. But anyway, we'll see what happens moving forward. But just, another disappointing stack for me. And, hopefully you guys didn't listen to me on these stacks too much because you guys would have been let down. Okay, so moving on to some running back picks now that I gave out last week. The first guy I gave out was Melvin Gordon. Melvin Gordon actually had his highest DraftKings point total on the season so far. And if you look at this stat line, it's just unbelievable how, kind of just cringy, if that's even a word, just how ugly this stat line is, but how it's still producing points. 19 rushing attempts for 36 yards. That's a 1.9 yards per carry average. 7 targets, 6 receptions on 43 receiving yards. But the kicker is 2 rushing touchdowns. Melvin Gordon has now been in the end zone on the ground at least once in every single game this season. And the first game of the season against the Chiefs, he had 2 rushing touchdowns. And obviously this game against the Saints, he had 2 rushing touchdowns. But the big bump in production for him has obviously been, the looks he's getting in the receiving game. This week he had 7 targets. Last week he had 7 targets. And his receiving yard total is actually the same exact for the past 2 weeks. He had 43 receiving yards this week, 43 receiving yards last week. The only difference was he had 6 receptions to 4 receptions in week 3. So he's putting up a just kind of mediocre stat line in the receiving and rushing game, but he's really capitalizing on the PPR and the rushing touchdown advantage you get. So going forward, Melvin Gordon is going to be continually going to be a guy that I'm going to look at, and it's just a good pick going forward because he's getting all the red zone carries. He's getting all the looks in the receiving game for halfbacks and the San Diego offense now with Danny Woodhead out. So Melvin Gordon is going to be a guy you have to take a look at every single week going forward, no matter how much his price goes up. Okay, so the next guy that I gave out was LeGarrette Blount, and this is something that I need to do better going forward because once I found out that Jimmy Garoppolo was not starting, I didn't play any Blount. I took him out of every single lineup that I had, and I need to do better. And when I say I need to do better, I need to communicate better on Twitter and whatnot on the changes that I want because I really did not like what I saw out of Brissett the other day. I mean, honestly, a lot of people are like, oh, he was so good against the Texans. I didn't like what I saw, really. And Blount played well that game, but it was really because of how the game went. The Texans just were never in that game, and that's why he got so many carries. And if you actually take a look here, the production out of Blount was actually pretty much what we've seen. Out of him, he just didn't get enough looks in this game. So if you look back to week 2, I think it is, against the Miami Dolphins, he had a 4.2 yards per carry average. Against the Houston Texans, he had a 4.4 yards per carry average. And against the Bills last week, he had a 4.2 yards per carry average. But he only got 13 rushing attempts, whereas in those other 2 games I just mentioned, he had 29 and 24 rushing attempts. And in both those games, he had rushing touchdowns and had over 100 yards rushing and put up over 20 DraftKings points. So, he didn't get enough volume. And, LeGarrette Blount is not a guy I target in cash game lineups anyway because he doesn't get enough looks in the pass game. Okay, so the third and final guy that I had was Jordan Howard. And this was actually a pretty obvious play. It was a pretty chalk play. $3,700, you had to have him in your lineup. And, he didn't get involved in the pass game as much as I was expecting him to. He had 4 targets on 3 receptions, 21 receiving yards, nothing special there. And he never got in the end zone, but, he still almost put up 20 DraftKings points. He put up 19.2 points on 23 rushing attempts, 111 rushing yards. So that's almost 5 yards per carry. So, moving forward, he's going to be a guy I'm going to look at. I just briefly took a glance at DraftKings pricing this coming week, and he's up to 5,200, which is a brutal increase. I was hoping he could be more like a Pryor was this week and be around the $4,300 range. He has just too good of a matchup this coming week. He's facing off against Indianapolis. We all know the Colts are very, very, very vulnerable to the running back, especially in the receiving game. So I'm not going to talk too much more about that this week because he may be a guy you're going to hear me mention again here soon. So running back picks were okay, but again, I need to get better on communicating how I'm feeling about specific players. Okay, so moving on to wide receivers now. The first guy that I gave out was T.Y. Hilton. He He ended up posting a pretty good day. Nothing spectacular, but 17.2 points on 10 targets, 7 receptions, only 42 receiving yards, but did have a receiving touchdown. This guy obviously was not even on the main Sunday slate, but I wanted to point him out anyway. That's probably something that I'm going to do from now on, is kind of just point out a guy who's not on the main Sunday slate from now on, whether it be a Thursday game, a Monday game, whatever. But so I just kind of want to throw him out there. He had like I said, he had a decent day at $7,000. It wasn't a complete bust at all for him. So, but the next guy I want to talk about is Amari Cooper, and he's who I gave out. He was a guy that I liked a lot in tournaments. I wasn't on him in cash, and that I was kind of fortunate that I wasn't, but I liked him a lot in a big tournament situation. And the reason I kind of liked him is because he hasn't had that big explosive game yet. He hasn't even been in the end zone yet this season, which is surprising. It just ended up being a crapshoot game. I mean, there's not really much else you can say. The reason I liked Cooper more is just because, like I said, he hadn't had a big game yet. I thought more people were going to be on Crabtree. Crabtree's been in the end zone quite a bit this season so far. He's had some better games up to this point, and he's cheaper, so I figured more people would be going his way. So I kind of wanted to pay up here and see if I could get a piece of this Oakland and Baltimore game. And I kind of spinned up and see if it was going to be a little bit, contrarian or oddball or whatever. And it really didn't end up working out for me. So, it's just one of those things. I like the pick. I don't regret the pick. And Amari Cooper's still going to be a guy I'm going to take a look at every single week. Moving on to the Ravens side now is the next guy I gave out, and that was Steve Smith. This is definitely my best, kind of sleeper play of the week probably. And Steve Smith, he had 11 targets, 8 receptions, and target to reception is exactly what he posted against the Jaguars last week. Last week, he also had 11 targets and 8 receptions. The big difference is, in this game, he had that big explosive play, put up 111 receiving yards on 1 receiving touchdown, and put up 28.1 points, which is definitely his best game of the season so far. And I really don't know what really kind of pointed me in the direction of him. I thought everybody was going to be on Mike Wallace. I wanted a piece of this game on both sides, and I just didn't want Pitta. Definitely don't want to touch any of the running backs right now for the Ravens. And, I just thought Steve Smith was in a good spot. Loved the price, and I played him a lot in GPP lineups, and it really paid off for me. As far as some of my other sleeper and value plays, I'm not going to toss any of them up on the screen, but be sure to check out my sleeper/value picks videos as well. Videos that I post. I usually post those on Friday or Thursday maybe, depending on how the video is going and how the week's going. So in that video, just a couple guys I want to point out really quickly. Number one, I already mentioned Jordan Howard. I mentioned him earlier in the video. I mentioned him in that video. Carlos Hyde was in there. I know Hyde had a decent game. He got in the end zone, put up a decent amount of points, especially for his price at $4,200. Terrell Pryor was another guy that I wanted to talk about. He put up 15 points exactly, I believe. And honestly, at that price point, you can't really complain about that too much. It's kind of what I expected out of him. Initially when I first thought about this game and kind of how it could go, I really envisioned, Pryor either blowing up for like 30-plus points again or putting up like 4 or 5. And then the more I thought about it, I realized, the Browns don't have that many weapons. Isaiah Crowell had a pretty good game as well, but the Browns don't have that many weapons. So he's gonna have such a high usage rate and volume and market share, whatever you want to call it. They're gonna try to get him the ball as much as possible. That it made a lot of sense that at bottom, at the floor type point percentage was gonna be, at least, like 14 to 15 plus points, and that's ended up what he ended up doing. Like 4 or 5 receptions, like for 40 something yards, and then had a touchdown or whatever. So the next guy I want to talk about is Will Fuller. I think Will Fuller put up 27 points or something like that. I'm kind of drawing a blank right now on how many points he put up, but I know he had a receiving touchdown. He also had a punt return touchdown, which actually won the Texans the game, I believe. And the real interesting stat that I wanted to point out that I heard was apparently some of these pads for the receivers and whatnot actually have microchips in them now or something. And I heard a stat that Will Fuller hit 21 miles per hour this week, which is actually the fastest player in the league in week 4. So that was a pretty interesting stat. So definitely something that I felt was worthy of pointing out. And Will Fuller was just in a good spot. And something else I need to point out is if you look at DeAndre Hopkins and Will Fuller and compare them in usage and whatnot and stats and everything like that, their usage is almost identical, and Will Fuller is so much cheaper. And it looks like Brock Osweiler is kind of connecting with Will Fuller a little bit more. Obviously, teams are kind of, directing all their attention towards DeAndre. So right now, Will Fuller is definitely got to be gonna be a guy who's on my radar each and every week. And this week was no different, and I'm glad I picked him. So be sure to check out those value picks that I give out, because sometimes you can see, big point totals out of guys who are really cheap. All right, so moving on to the next few picks that I gave out. Number 1 was Greg Olsen. Now, Olsen got off to a rocky start, and honestly, this whole game for the Panthers was just kind of blah. And, he kind of salvaged, though. He had quite a few targets in this game. In fact, he had 13 targets, only hauled in 6 of those passes, but was able to have 76 receiving yards, and, of course, he had that big receiving touchdown. So he was able to salvage a good fantasy day out of what ended up being a really ugly, lopsided game. And, Greg Olsen is just, what can you say about him? I mean, he's old, reliable, old faithful is what Panther Nation calls him. And, he is. I mean, he's just so sure-handed. I heard a stat in the offseason about Greg Olsen. In his entire career, he has never dropped a pass in the red zone. Not a single pass. So that just blows my mind. I mean, that is just almost like unfathomable to me. So anyway, so Greg Olsen ended up putting up 21 points. I mean, you can't complain. If Cam doesn't play, whether Cam plays or not this coming week against the Buccaneers, he's a guy I'm going to be taking a look at. I haven't looked at pricing yet too in depth, so I'm not really sure what his price is this coming up week, but he's going to be an interesting guy I'm going to be targeting on the primetime slate. So the next tight end that I gave out was Hunter Henry at 16.1 points and 2,700. You cannot complain at all. 7 targets, 4 receptions, 61 receiving yards, and that receiving touchdown. This is a guy who was only a couple $100 over the minimum tight end price. Put up 16 points. I had a lot of Hunter Henry and I had a lot of Zach Miller. I was leaning towards Zach Miller a little bit in cash games, believe it or not. I just kind of like the matchup a little bit more. The reason I like the matchup for Zach Miller so much is the Detroit Lions give up more fantasy points to tight ends than any other team in the league. And that's one of the reasons going back to Greg Olsen really quickly, that's one of the reasons I like Greg Olsen so much. The Falcons are the second worst team in terms of giving up fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So, I was targeting really, really poor defensive teams when it comes to, facing tight ends. I mean, it's a pretty obvious tactic, but it worked out this week. And, that's one of the reasons I wanted Zach Miller. Hunter Henry was a pretty obvious play as well. You had super cheap guys. Him and Zach Miller were the same exact price, so it made sense to kind of, move them in and out of cash game lineups, and that's exactly what I did. So, and then last but not least, we have the Denver defense. This is another pretty obvious play. Put up 15 DraftKings points. One of their better fantasy days in a little while. 5 sacks, forced a fumble, had 2 interceptions. And they didn't have any defensive touchdowns, but, honestly, beggars can't be choosers. And, 15 points, I'm not begging for any more points out of my defense. If they're giving me, anytime your defense can give you 10-plus points, you should be, happy and run away with that, So, definitely pleased with the Denver defense. So that's going to do it for this week's recap. Next week, I may do it a little bit different. I may go a little bit more in depth into my cash game lineups. Let me know if you want me to start doing separate videos on specific slates. I can do that. But until then, thank you for tuning in. This video is probably going to be a little lengthy. I kind of wanted to do it more like a podcast type style. But anyway, thank you for watching, and be sure to tune into my videos moving forward. I post at least 2 videos a week now, and I hope you guys enjoy it. Thank you for watching. Later.